So we're going to talk about oil today. This is a picture in front of the Valero refinery. We used to go on a field trip there. They used to actually let us in and walk us around. And then they wouldn't let us in with without a bunch of PPE, and now they'll only let us to the gate, so we don't go on this field trip anymore. This was the last one we went where we could stand outside and they could point to things. It didn't seem quite a field trip. But you can see the Valero refinery behind it, behind us. This is up in the North Bay. So if anybody's driven along 80, like you're heading to Tahoe, you pass all the refineries up in Martinez and Richmond and those areas. All right, so let's talk about oil. You've already gotten some review of oil, so we'll skip through some of it because we've already talked about some of the upstream aspects, right? Jane talked us through intro to fossil fuels, gave us a big picture, and then how do we get the oil out of the ground? And so we're going to talk mostly today about making the products from oil that we want and the markets a little bit and what influences our economics. But these are just some big picture questions to kind of keep in mind as you're thinking about oil. Definitely geopolitics is a big one. We'll talk a little bit about that today. How we move it around, transport of oil we're going to talk about because that can have big economic impacts. It's different between different transport modes and also more environmental risk with certain modes. So we'll talk about those. We'll think about producing oil from places like Canada. We kind of touched on that in our first lecture, but we're going to talk a bit about how that happens. And then we'll try to get into the transportation fuels. We might hit that in a later lecture, but still something to think about. You guys have seen this before, so I just want to remind you where we're at today. Drilling, that's where we start, right? That's accessing our reservoir. And then once the pressures decline, when we start producing it, we start pumping it out. And so pump jacks, that's producing it, right? So we've gotten the oil, we've found it, we've gotten it out of the ground. Now we're going to talk about moving it and then making it into the stuff that we want for our transportation fuels. Okay, so big picture. Not all oil is the same. That's no surprise to any of you, right? And so that is going to impact its price. It's going to impact how much energy it takes to process it into the fuels we want. Oil is very different in different parts of the world and how we're getting it out of the ground. So we'll talk about the quality of the oil. Oil, petroleum, these are kind of used interchangeably. Petroleum products, that's the stuff that's coming out of the refinery. So just some terminology about oil. Much of it is traded globally. So oil is a global commodity. Natural gas is becoming more so, but for a long time, oil was really the one that was really, truly a global commodity. And part of that is because of its energy density, right? So it can still maintain a lot of its economic value moving it far distances because it's energy dense from a volume and a weight standpoint. So we've been moving oil around, and you can see almost 3/4 of world oil is traded globally. You've got this picture, so we're just going to keep hammering this nail on the head, I guess. Oil, the U.S. is the #1 oil producer and the #1 oil consumer. And we'll look at that, some charts on that today, but we've been the #1 consumer for a long time. Being the #1 oil producer and the #1 oil producer ever is a really big place. I mean, it's a new space for the U.S., and that's a very recent phenomenon. Okay. We'll talk about how we transport it. Much of it moves by water over the oceans. And then we have to refine it. You guys watched the video about that. We'll talk a little bit more about refining in order to make the products. It doesn't come out of the ground how we want to use it, right? It doesn't come out of the ground typically as gasoline. And so we've got to do things to it in order to make the fuels that we want for our transportation system. In the US, we mostly make it into gasoline. That's our biggest product. We talked about the energy density, and then of course we're going to talk about the environmental issues. So we have both present, right now, environmental issues in terms of air pollution and those kind of impacts, and then we have legacy issues. Jane talked a little bit about abandoned oil wells, for example. That is one of the legacy issues. Closed refineries, we're going to talk about that a little bit more today. That's another legacy issue. Often those are companies that no longer exist. Refineries tend to be a very toxic site, and so it's left to the federal government, becomes our Superfund sites, becomes taxpayers' money that clean up those sites. And so there are these legacy environmental issues from our oil use. So let's start with our our big picture charts. You guys have seen this before. Just to remind you that oil is the #1 energy resource in the world today. So if we're looking at our snapshot for our energy use, it's #1. It's not used a ton in electricity. Because it's so valuable as a transportation fuel and there's other options in a lot of cases for electricity, we don't use it much for the electricity. So you can see the difference in the pie charts at the top. We're talking about energy, oil is a big one. When you're talking about electricity generation, it tends to be pretty small. This is just another way of looking at that. So we've looked at our spaghetti diagrams for all of our resources. This is just looking at the US for oil. So you can get a sense of where are we getting our oil and what is it going to in one chart. So you can see here we're importing about 1/3 of our oil supply and producing about 2/3 of our oil supply. And then we're exporting about 20% of that supply. And that's a new thing too. So we weren't allowed to export oil from the US, crude oil from the US, until 2015. Why? Why wouldn't we be allowed to export crude oil? Yeah, energy security, right? And so it wasn't a policy, but then there was some negotiation in 2015 in order to extend the subsidies for renewables. The Democrats kind of made a deal with the Republican Party who wanted the option of exporting oil. We've seen exports of crude oil increase since 2015 when that policy changed and was allowed. So exports, and then of course we've long exported refined products. So that's the stuff at the back end of the refinery. So we were always allowed to take the crude oil in, make the gasoline and diesel, and then sell the gasoline and diesel in other markets outside of the US. It was just the crude oil that added in 2015. So you can see we export refined products. And then the products that go into, or oil goes into transportation or into industrial, and about half of that is feedstocks and half of it is just burning things for transportation fuels. So even some of that industrial piece is going into our transportation fuels. Okay, I usually get the question of why do we both import and export oil? So it is decision making by economics by different individual companies on whether they're importing oil and exporting oil. The other big limiting factor is access to oil. And we're going to talk about California does not have pipelines to the rest of the US to import crude. We can get crude from Alaska and California and the ocean, foreign sources. And so some of it is just because of the infrastructure and access to the crude oil. So we have to import a lot of our oil into California. Did you have a question? Did that answer your question? Yeah.
Is it true that most of the crude oil produced by the US is exported and that most of the crude oil refined in the US is imported due to the way US oil refineries were built?
Yeah, and so yes, that is another factor. So we'll talk about refining in terms of refineries are built to process a certain viscosity of crude oil. And so it has to blend or match the crude oil that's coming in. And so they can blend, so they can take some from the US and some from foreign sources and try to blend it, but they have to be within the crude oil box in terms of the type of crude oil that they process. And so we'll look at that a little bit later, but it's a factor because the crude oil, depending on where you're producing it, even in the US, there's a lot of variety of oil. We tend to have a lot of our big refineries tend to be able to process kind of the guckiest oil. They have a lot of processing capability. Okay, cool. All right, so you've seen this before. So yeah, we only have 4% of the world's proved oil reserves. Yet we are the #1 producer and consumer. So about 20% for both production and consumption. And you can see these are broken down. This is in the data between OECD. That's kind of like the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, but it's kind of considered the developed world, versus OPEC, Organization of Petroleum Exporting Countries. So OPEC, think of those as petrostates, states that have a lot of oil and export that and work together as a group to decide on production rates and things like that to try to influence market share and price of oil. And so we divided into these in terms of thinking about production and consumption because it matters for markets, right? Who are the users and who are the producers of the oil? Okay, so this map has changed a lot in terms of OPEC's share and OECD's share with the growth in oil production in the US. And so one of the impacts of that is that OPEC has less impact on markets than it used to, and we're seeing some of that. It's like a softening of impact today. All right, so I like to look at snapshots, and I also like to look at how things change over time. So this is kind of the same thing. We're looking at production and consumption, but over time. So like I said, we're this North America wedge. The US has been a big consumer for a long time, but you can really see the dramatic increase in production in North America in the last 15 or 20 years or so. And so you can really see that growth. And this also kind of really shows that Middle East has long been a big oil producer in terms of the world. And we're seeing a lot of growth in consumption in Asia Pacific, China in particular, but India quickly is growing as well. So I said this is a milestone. It's a pretty recent milestone where the US is producing more crude oil than any other country ever before. And so this is just looking at the top producers of crude oil and how the US in the last few years has become the #1 producer. And like I said, more oil than any other country in history. You've seen something like this before, just looking at that a little bit more over time, where our consumption isn't growing a lot in the US, and there's actually talk about it leveling off or declining with other options in the US. But certainly our exports are growing, our net imports are declining, and our production is growing a lot. So becoming more and more of a oil exporting country. We are a net exporter. What does that mean? That means in terms of if we looked at both crude oil plus the refined products that we export. So we're not just talking about crude oil, we're talking about the crude oil plus the gasoline and diesel and other products that we export. We are now a net exporter. So also a relatively new place for the United States to be in terms of being a net exporter of oil and refined products. All right, any questions on that?
Is there any evidence that Saudi Arabia is intentionally holding back oil production and letting the US be the leader so they can have long-term pricing and supply rights?
Yeah, it's a great question. It kind of leads into what I was going to talk about next in terms of OPEC. OPEC is usually puts out what their production plans are, and certainly it is they are trying to balance both price and market share. And there have been times when when the shale revolution was just getting started and the US was kind of coming online, it was a lot of mom and pop businesses that were, small companies that were developing, doing the horizontal drilling, hydraulic fracturing. It was a lot of almost wildcatting. And so at the time, Saudi Arabia increased production and lowered prices and drove a lot of those out of the market. And so absolutely, there is that, contention of trying to both have market share and control price. And they're usually, they usually are pretty open about what their production plans are in terms of how they're balancing both market share and the value that they're getting out of their oil. And of course, just like any other, organization of different countries, they don't always see eye to eye. So it can be contentious sometimes there in terms of getting on the same page on their production plans. OPEC has 12 member countries, but there are also what are called OPEC Plus, which are kind of listed on here, places like Russia and other countries that sometimes cooperate with OPEC in terms of coming up with these plans to impact oil markets. All right, so OPEC, they are oil exporting countries, places that tend to have a lot of those reserves. You saw that in the chart. Other terms I just want you to be familiar with, petrostate. This is a term really looking at countries that are very dependent on that oil for their economic growth, for their participation in the global economy. And sometimes those petrostates can have a very concentrated, wealthy group that controls a lot of that oil wealth. And so there are times when this actually isn't the best for society at large because that oil money can stay concentrated in governments. And so some of these countries do have widespread corruption or might be marked by poor human rights records, things like that. So it's one of the challenges. And so one of the terms that's kind of been put to this is resource curse, which basically is just saying that abundance of oil doesn't mean that your country is doing well for everyone. It can be just really supporting a wealthy few and not everyone. And we've seen challenges of that in places like Nigeria, where there's a lot of oil theft in terms of the broader society. So when we're talking about decarbonization and climate change, we've talked a lot about in this class already, there has been some commitment by some of our oil companies or our oil industry to move into clean energy. I think we're right now seeing a kind of a pullback on a lot of that. But just to kind of put the numbers to it, they're definitely, most of their focus is still on their bread and butter on oil and gas. They have small kind of investments in clean energy, but it's certainly not the biggest part of what our oil and gas companies are doing. And of course, they're getting under a lot of pressure. Right now, California is suing oil companies like ExxonMobil for their involvement in, misinformation around climate change. So they're under a lot of, I guess there's a lot of factors that are impacting our oil industry right now. So just to remind you, oil is responsible for about a third of our energy-related greenhouse gas emissions. You've seen this chart before. Energy is about 3/4 of our total greenhouse gas emissions. So oil is a big piece of that in terms of its environmental impact. And we'll talk more about environmental impacts in a little bit. All right, big picture on markets. If you're interested in markets and oil price and what impacts it, the EIA has this nice little tool where you can look at, they have the 7 factors that impact oil prices. Of course, just like other things, it's supply and demand. It's just there's a lot of things that impact supply and demand to impact oil price. I would argue that oil price is one of the commodities where we watch the price the most. I think people would know more what a gallon of gasoline costs than a gallon of milk or a gallon of water. It's certainly something that is very present in a lot of people's lives in terms of keeping track of the price and the things that are impacting it. And historically, we had pretty stable oil prices through, about the 60s, and then the Arab oil embargo in the 70s really garnered a lot of attention in terms of how impactful the supply of oil was to a lot of different countries' economies. And so we will talk a lot about different policies that came out after that Arab oil embargo in 1973, including things on energy efficiency, on biofuels. Places like Brazil really looked at biofuels domestically after the Arab oil embargo. It really changed a lot in terms of policies in place. We've already talked about PURPA, and you'll hear more about PURPA again. But you can see that since then, volatility has been pretty much a piece of our oil markets in terms of price. And of course, I added some new things here and things that are impacting our oil price even today. So just to take a step on geopolitics, for Russia's invasion of Ukraine, one of the things Europe tried to do was to put sanctions on Russian oil. It is a very challenging thing to put sanctions on a global commodity like this. And so you can see there are countries that are backing the sanction, countries that are not. What does this lead to? This leads to just a distortion in the market where Russia is selling cheaper oil, but there's a growth in like Russian oil going to places like India and China that are taking advantage of that cheaper commodity. So it's a very challenging way to try to put pressure on Russia in terms of trying to sanction this global commodity. And then, of course, Right now, the unrest in the Middle East has definitely makes the oil industry and pay attention. It hasn't risen prices a lot, although they are up some. You can see a price of a barrel of oil is around $78 today. But certainly it is something that a lot of countries are paying attention to. And then you can see, Biden's, discouraging Israel from striking Iran's oil industry. And that's purely because we don't want oil to become expensive and it to start impacting our consumers, right? So oil and the reliance on the oil definitely complicates geopolitics. And there's always examples of that. One of the things we have in place to try to buffer, we want to try to buffer those global unrests from our economy is we have our Strategic Petroleum Reserve. So this was put in place since 1975 after the Arab oil embargo, so one of the many policies that came out. We have over 700 million barrels of oil, about 35 days of supply stored in these big salt dome caverns in the Gulf of Mexico. You can see them kind of along the Texas and Louisiana coast. And it is something that the president can buy and sell out of. So you can see it's not actually full right now. When oil prices go up, presidents tend to sell out of it. And when oil prices go down, they tend to buy into it. Right? So it's almost using it as like a bank to arbitrage costs. You can see in terms of its actual impact, if we did have an oil supply disruption, how much could it really help? We can only get it out at about 4 million barrels a day. So that's, a quarter or less of the oil that we need on a daily basis in terms of our daily consumption. So how much would that actually impact if we had an oil supply disruption is definitely a question, but it was one of the policies that came out to try to address our energy security risks and our economic risks with our dependence on oil. So that's kind of the big picture, history, significance of markets. Let's talk about oil. So you've seen this before. If you just think about a progression of complexity of hydrocarbons, natural gas is a really simple one. Oil is getting more complex, and then coal is even more complex further. Longer chains of hydrocarbons is our oil. And so like natural gas, we have these ways of talking about our oil. And so we have the API gravity, high, intermediate, and low. So high is our light stuff. It's really liquidy, closer to gasoline. That's our light oils. And then heavy or low API, it's really thick, viscous stuff. We talked about our bitumen, and we'll talk about that more in a minute. And then sulfur content, sweet or sour. And then we also talk about it in terms of the geographic location where it comes from. And so when we talk about what is the cost of a barrel of oil, it has to do with where it came from. We use the North Sea and West Texas Intermediate, so Brent and WTI is kind of like the benchmark. Those are the two that when you hear, like I just said, it's $78 per barrel, it's going to be one of those two. It's either Brent or WTI. That's just kind of the benchmark. But all of these different places have very different viscosity, very different in terms of sweet and sour. They're going to have very different prices depending on the quality of the oil. Okay, so let's look at oil. All right, don't open these and don't drop them. We don't want an oil spill. Okay, so this is Texas crude oil, West Texas Intermediate. So like one of those benchmarks. You can see it's a very light, very nice oil. This is also what you would kind of see coming out of Saudi Arabia. Pretty nice oil. What does that mean? It means it's really easy to make it into things like gasoline because it's almost there already, right? So I'll pass this around. This is our Texas. All right, but we're in California. So let's talk about California oil. We've talked a lot about San Ardo. This is what comes out of the ground at San Ardo. So that's what comes out of the ground in Texas. This is what comes out of the ground. This was literally taken off of a spout off of one of the pump jacks. This is what comes out of the ground in San Ardo. We talked about it being more of a water processing plant than an oil producing plant because you have all these gucky water that you have to deal with, and then they re-inject it into wastewater wells that are outside the reservoir. So you can see a very, very thick oil. It doesn't even really mix with the water in terms of what's coming out of our California reservoirs. Once you've separated the oil out, this is what the San Ardo oil looks like. Don't shake this very much because this is just going to look like a black jar, and it'll take about a day and a half for it to settle back down. So you can shake it a little bit, and you can see when it comes up the wall, it just stays black. It's very thick, heavy, not really high quality oil. So there's a lot of variety in terms of the oil that we get out of the ground. California is not known for its nice oils. We didn't really talk about oil sands and tar sands yet, so I'm going to take a little sidestep and talk about oil sands and tar sands. This is a picture of an open pit mine in Alberta, Canada. Very much the way you get oil sands or tar sands out of the ground is strip mining. That's the biggest way you're going to get it out. And so that's clearing the land, clearing everything off of it, and digging the oil out. Okay, so oil sands and tar sands, we already talked about. Those are in Venezuela and Canada. There are more money to extract, more energy to extract. It is the main type of oil that we are getting out of Canada. For a long time, we knew this oil was there, but barrels of oil were too cheap to make it economic. Didn't really become economic until about 2003, and it's kind of stayed economic since. We talk about this in San Ardo. Even sometimes when San Ardo, because it's more expensive to get it out of San Ardo than out of like Texas, even when they're not making a profit, sometimes they keep operating the field because it's hard to shut down and start it back up. And so they just try to ride out those low oil prices and hope that it comes back up. Because there's so much heat that they have to put in the ground to make the oil move, you don't want to lose that heat. You don't want to start over again. So they keep producing a lot of times. And you'll see that sometimes in the oil sands as well. There's two ways: open pit mining, which you just saw a picture of, and then in situ, where in that case, you're kind of like San Ardo, you're injecting steam into the ground to try to make it flow enough that you can actually get it out of a well. Obviously, these two different methods have very different surface impacts and environmental impacts. So there's a little video about this in terms of the environmental impacts of this kind of extraction. And so I just kind of listed some of the challenges. Things to point out, you're using 2 to 5 barrels of water to produce each barrel of crude oil. And that's really because the water is the carrier of the heat that you're using to try to warm up that oil to make it flow enough. And then sometimes you have to process it a little bit right there, even to get it into a transportation system in order to get it to refinery. With San Ardo, they just keep it hot, and they can keep it hot either on tanker cars or on trucks in order to ship it to refinery. Yeah, question?
Does the water used have to be very pure?
Yeah, that's a great question. No, it doesn't have to be super, super pure. It just has to be able to be made into steam, and you want your steam process not to gunk up too much with stuff. So sometimes hardness is a challenge. But a lot of times they're getting that water out of rivers, lakes, whatever's available locally to make the steam. And then they're using natural gas to burn, to make the steam, and then to use it to heat up the oil. So pretty energy intense, pretty carbon intensive process to get oil out of these places. Okay, so obviously a significant impact on the land, and so it's part of what is so controversial about the oil sands and tar sands. All right, so let's talk about transportation of oil and then oil refining. So you guys saw the little video about the tanker. So tankers is how we're moving a lot of the oil around over the ocean. And then pipeline tends to be the main way we move it around over land. This is actually a picture of the Trans-Alaskan pipeline. It's been in place for a long time, bringing oil from the North Shore, which Jane talked about in terms of oil production that's happening on the North Shore of Alaska, down to places like California and the lower 48. You can see it's above ground partially to allow wildlife to go under the pipeline. So you can see it's up high enough for like the caribou and stuff to continue to migrate. It's also because this ground changes a lot for summer versus winter. So permafrost, it's also just like it's solid and hard in the winter. When it freezes, it melts and gets kind of swampy in the summer. So it's another reason they kind of have elevated infrastructure in terms of their pipelines. All right, so I mentioned we move a lot of our oil around, and we move much of it around as crude oil. Like I said, we tend to make it into the products we want closer to our markets. This is just a colorful graph showing kind of where the crude oil is coming from and what countries it's going to. So you can see Canada is really exporting to us. We're right next door, makes it an easy export. Middle East is providing oil to a lot of different countries as one of the places where it's a major exporter. And then Russia, you've really seen a growth in those green wedges to China and India as Europe has put sanctions on a lot of that Russian oil. And so that's kind of a part of the landscape that's really changed. And so these are just kind of the net exporting and net importing regions. So places like China and Europe, very dependent on oil imports. And then, of course, places like Russia, Middle East, Canada, those are net exporters and have been for a long time. So we move the oil around, and at times, and you'll hear this in the news, right, it's subject to piracy. There are choke points in our global shipping system that make it vulnerable to piracy, to groups trying to impact policy by disrupting oil trade. And so this is just showing what some of those routes are. So some of these choke points, you can kind of see the narrow straits where a lot of the ships, like the Suez Canal, places like that, where the ships can go through. That just means that they're going to have to take longer routes to get to the places they're going when that kind of disruption is happening. So it's just one of our vulnerabilities in terms of our oil supply system, are some of these choke points. And this is just an example of kind of a recent incident in the Red Sea and how it impacted the trade. All right, so we're moving this crude oil over water primarily. We do some with the petroleum products. It's just giving you some of the stats on that and how far they're moving. The organizations that really regulate this kind of international trade on these ships are things like Maripol, which really is around the marine pollution. So there's been restrictions that have come down in terms of sulfur emissions that are allowed. So typically these big tankers are using what we call the bottom of the barrel, bunker fuel. It's like the worst fuel that we have. And we put it on ships, and then they go burn it out of over the open ocean because then maybe the air pollution isn't impacting anyone. Well, that is less and less, there's been more and more restrictions on that in terms of the sulfur emissions and the emissions from those bunker fuels. And then often they have to switch to a cleaner fuel or plug into electricity at the port in order to keep the air pollution down at the ports. And certainly there's restrictions on that in the US. And so these are kind of the agencies that govern a lot of that kind of regulation. These tankers are huge, and so I just kind of like to put a tanker kind of next to some buildings, and so you can see, they're longer than the Eiffel Tower is tall. They're huge. Crude oil ones tend to be the biggest. Those are the ones that are really ocean going, moving the farthest. You can see the refined product ones tend to be smaller. They tend to be going closer range. These larger crude oil tankers, though, can't fit through some of those things like the Suez Canal and the Panama Canal. And so they do have size restrictions in terms of what route they're going through. There are size restrictions in order to fit in the locks, in order to go through some of those locations. So they're called clean tankers or dirty tankers, not because they're clean or dirty, but it just means whether they're a product tanker, like they've already been refined, or it's just the crude oil. That's our dirty tankers. All right, so a very significant event for our oil tankers was in 1989, the Exxon Valdez oil tanker spill. Not the biggest oil spill out of a tanker, but one of the most impactful because it was such an environmentally sensitive area and an area that was very hard to clean up. And so this, obviously there was a lot of news coverage on this in terms of this oil spill and the impact on the environment. But the impact that it had on oil tankers and on shipping is going from what we called single hulled to double hulled tankers. So at the time of single hull, just kind of what it sounds like, the outside of the tanker was the outside of the oil container. So if you punctured a hole in it, all the oil would come out, right? It was right there. Now we only allow double hulled oil tankers in US waters and US ports. And so what that means is that there's a buffer, there's a space between the container that's holding the oil and the outside of the oil tanker itself. And you guys saw some video about oil tankers and how that works. So that's been since 2015 that they're not allowed in US ports. All right, so spills. The good news is that spills have gotten better. This is just showing you just from ocean or water going shipping. So in the green is kind of like big spills. You would think that is like the Exxon Valdez, like very large spills, so over 700 tons. And then the blue are smaller spills. And so you can see we're getting better at having fewer spills, even as our oil transportation has increased. So we're spilling about 0.001% of the global oil that's transported. So that's great. But of course, even these smaller spills are going to be very impactful locally. We had a big oil tanker that went down this year, or maybe it was the end of last year in the Philippines. They can still have a lot of impact on the local coastline and environment when they do happen. When oil is spilled in water, there's a few ways we try to take care of that. Oil does float on water. You guys can see that in the little jar we're passing around. So there are ways you try to gather it off the surface first. You see booms and things like that. You can actually even burn it off the top of the water. You can use surfactants and things to try to collect it. There's bacteria that break it down. But if you imagine that you're in the ocean and there's waves and other things, it can get really challenging unless you really address it really quickly. And then the oil will start to disperse and get very hard to remediate. And we've seen that with offshore platforms like we saw with BP, impacting the area for a long time. Very challenging in an ocean environment to clean up that oil. Okay, so that's oceans. Let's talk about pipelines next. That's kind of the main way that we move oil around on land. And it's a lot cheaper, it's a lot more efficient than moving it around other ways. And so you can see that, for domestic or even foreign, a lot of that's Canada. We're moving it around in pipeline. We have a pretty extensive pipeline system. You can see for both crude oil and products in the US. But you can see California is kind of isolated over there. We don't have crude oil pipelines to where much of the shale revolution is going on in places like South Dakota or Texas. There's no crude oil pipelines to get it there. So we're kind of isolated over in this part of the market. I sometimes get asked, how do we move different products down the same pipe in a petroleum, for the petroleum products pipelines? And the answer is that we usually just separate them out with something called a pig. Has anybody ever heard of a pig in terms of pipelines? A few people. Okay, so I don't know why it's called a pig, but it's like a plug that you put in that you can push down a pipe. Sometimes it's used to clean out pipes, so you can just air blast something. If you need to clean out a pipe, you push a plug of this pig through it, and it'll clean out your pipe. Well, when you have different products, sometimes they separate them by a pig. So they might put gasoline into there, and then they put a pig in, and then they put diesel in there. Sometimes if they're not worried about it mixing, they just put one in after another. And there's some mix at the interface, and you kind of have to time it. And you're like, oh, gasoline's coming out now. Okay, now diesel's coming out. And there's just some mixture between the products. So you're kind of batching them down the pipelines. Fun fact. All right. Okay, so pipelines are also a challenge in terms of keeping the oil inside the pipelines. Tends to be a relatively low rate of leakage, but again, it can have a lot of impact on different communities. I've just kind of shown some example pictures. There's more in the notes. Just like our electric system, our pipelines are going across states, and so they're also regulated by FERC, our Federal Energy Regulatory Commission, because of that cross-state transport. Finally, I don't want to leave out rail. We don't move oil by rail very much, but we did see this spike in transporting oil by rail when the shale oil revolution was just getting started, because we didn't have pipe infrastructure for a lot of these new places that we were suddenly producing oil. South Dakota was not an oil producer before the shale revolution, so they did not have a pipeline infrastructure, and so they were shipping it by oil. By rail. Very quickly, we had some very graphic, explosive accidents with oil by rail. And so there was a lot of pressure not to move oil by rail following those accidents. And so you can see we kind of peaked in that 2014 timeframe, and then we've kind of come back down to only about 1% of our crude oil is transported by rail today, as we built out pipeline networks primarily to reach some of those producing fields like in South Dakota. All right, let's talk about refining and how do we make the products, because just like with a lot of our other energy resources, how it comes out of the ground isn't how we want to use it. And so we've got to do stuff to it. And you guys saw a video about refining a little bit. But what we're really trying to do is we're taking the crude oil we get out, which is this whole mix of thick and thin and all sorts of different kinds of lengths of hydrocarbons, into the useful products that we want. So to give you a sense of where refining takes place, I mentioned a lot of times it's going to take place closer to markets. And so you can see much of the refining capacity is in Asia Pacific, North America, Europe, these big markets for the fuels. I put up the US capacity by company because it's usually surprising for people to see who are the actual leaders in refining capacity in terms of our oil companies. It's not the ones you would typically think of, like the Exxon or Chevron. The bigger refiners are more like Marathon, Valero. These are refining-only companies. So our companies like Chevron and Exxon Mobil, those are vertically integrated. They do everything from finding the oil to refining it, to selling it to consumers. Companies like Marathon and Valero, they just do the refining piece. And so they have a pretty big market. And the oil that you buy at your Exxon Mobil station may have come from a Marathon refinery. It comes from a local refinery. It doesn't necessarily come from the refinery that it's selling it through. And then what a distributor like a Chevron or Exxon or Valero will do is they'll add kind of their mix of secret sauce into the oil. Chevron talks about Techron, right? Those are just things that kind of clean up the engines and things like that. Aren't really a part of the energy that's being added to your car. That makes it their blend of gasoline or diesel or whatever that you're buying at their station. But it could have come from any other refineries. It just comes from local refining capacity. Okay. All right, much of the refining capacity in the US is on the Gulf Coast. Certainly near where I grew up. I grew up right near what's called the Houston Ship Channel, where the ships were coming in and offloading oil, and very large refineries in places like Baytown off of the Texas coast. But you can see a lot of it is in the Gulf Coast. This starts to matter if there's something like a hurricane coming through the Gulf Coast, because it can really have impacts on supply and markets for these refined products. So what's been happening in the refinery landscape? I know there's kind of a lot going on this chart, so I'll take you guys through it. We have been closing refineries for the most part in the US. And you can see here in the 1950s, we had over 300 refineries. Today, we have about 130 refineries. We haven't built a big refinery since the late 70s. What we've done to increase our products is to add on to existing refineries. We just add capacity for the most part. We've added some little refineries, and most of that, again, has to do with the shale revolution. If you couldn't move the crude oil, maybe you set up a small refinery right near where you're producing the oil, and then you could start selling products right where you are. And so we've seen some little refineries be put in place since the shale revolution, but big refineries, we really have stopped building them. So you can see the average refining capacity has grown. Total refining capacity has pretty much grown as we have been shutting down refineries. And so what's the impact of this? I mentioned closed refineries are often a legacy issue. Often the company that ran that refinery no longer exists, and it becomes the impact of state, local, federal government in order to clean up those refinery sites. We've talked some about this, so we'll just look at a picture that bringing it down to California and our 14 refineries. We almost have 2 distinct markets, Northern California and Southern California. We refine our own fuels for those markets. Where are we getting our oil? It used to be a lot from California and Alaska, but as Alaska's production has declined and California's production has declined, more and more it's coming from foreign sources. And you can see it's kind of a variety of foreign sources that we're bringing crude oil into California. We have a very large gasoline market, and so you can see even as our refinery number have declined over time, our production has increased dramatically. And if we were our own country, I used to say if we were our own country, we would be 3rd on this list, but Texas actually is a bigger gasoline market than us, so I added them. So Texas would actually be 3rd, and we'd now be 5th gasoline market in the world after the rest of the US and China. And you can see India has really come up this chart in the last 10 years. Yeah, question.
Is there a reason why they don't transport oil with trains?
Yeah, well, a lot of it is regulation and people not wanting to bring oil over the mountains in California. And it's true, we're actually restricted on rail too. So a lot of the communities where that infrastructure would be built has resisted having that infrastructure actually come through. So there was some desire to bring like shale oil in on rail through places like Tahoe, and communities just don't want that infrastructure coming in through the Sierra Nevada mountains. Okay, so I mentioned that our refineries are made to blend they're made to process a certain crude oil, certain sweet sourness, a certain heavy lightness. So this is the actual chart from our local Valero refinery. That green box is the range of API and the range of sulfur content that they can process at their refinery. And so what they do is this is what they're buying, they buy all these different crude oils and they blend them so that they fit in that box. So you can change a refinery in terms of what it processes, but it takes a lot of capital investment. And so typically they try to stay right within their box. That's the kind of crude oil that they can process. All right, so let's talk about refining in our last couple minutes. And you saw a video about this. So there's kind of 5 main processes. There's distillation, there's cracking, there's desulfurization, so taking the sulfur out, and then there's reforming because we want certain types and shapes of molecules. And then of course we blend to get the products we want. As you guys were quizzed on, our distillation column, what are we doing? We're just heating up the oil and separating it out by vapor pressures. And so every refinery will have a distillation column. The most simple refineries just have a distillation column. I mean, you could just separate out the fractions, take it off the distillation column, and use them for whichever mix of oil that you have. Okay, so you're separating them out. So you can see that our gasolines are kind of the lighter stuff. And then of course, down at the bottom, we have things like our diesel and then our asphalt bunker fuel coming off the bottom of the barrel. In order to upgrade the oil, to get some of those lighter fractions that we want, like gasoline, like jet fuel, we have to break apart those hydrocarbons and make them shorter chains. And so we do that in a few different ways. There's thermal cracking, catalytic cracking, hydrocracking. These are just different ways of breaking those hydrocarbon bonds to make them shorter chains to upgrade the oil that we have. When I worked a couple summers at the Exxon refinery down in Baton Rouge, the catalytic cracker was like the heart. That's like the heart of the refinery. That's the thing you want to keep running all of the time. And that is really what is allowing us to upgrade our oil and sell more gasoline than the crude oil would allow us just coming in. Then we want to take the sulfur out in order to meet air pollution requirements and to protect our catalysts, because sulfur will poison our catalysts. And so we want our catalysts to keep running in our refinery. So we remove sulfur in a couple ways, hydrocracking and hydrotreating. And then, like I said, we reform some of those hydrocarbons into different shapes. And this is what can boost things like our octane in our fuels. So we're making gasoline. We actually get more product out than crude oil we put in. It's kind of this fun, like we put in 42 gallons of crude oil and we get 45 gallons of products. It's fun math. That's because it's lighter, so it takes up more space, so its volume is bigger. And you also add hydrogen in spots. When you're breaking those hydrocarbons apart, a lot of times you're adding hydrogen to those shorter chains. There's a lot of questions on the future of the refineries, what's going to happen as our gasoline demand maybe goes down. We've seen a decline in gasoline demand. We're certainly seeing it in California, where our refineries are looking at transforming to supply renewable fuels instead of the gasoline and diesel that they've done in the past. So refineries and the demand for refineries is changing. There's a lot of environmental regulations on the refineries, so they have a lot of challenges. I'll let you read through that on your own. And just to remind you that the fence line communities, Holmes talked about this, and you guys had a reading on it. Fence line communities, this is the one I worked at in Baton Rouge in the summer. There are impacts to land value and to the local communities, and you can see in Baton Rouge, it's very much segregated in terms of what communities are being impacted by the oil refineries. They often want a green or a buffer zone around them. You can see this as Valero to try to separate some of those impacts from the communities. But these are just some examples from local. We do have these impacts on our local communities. So it's just another impact of our oil system. Okay, thank you guys for your attention today.